So, hello everyone. How are you? Good morning. This presentation is going to hopefully be instructive for some of you. I tried to give some highlights into key concepts in ocean sciences, focusing on cycles and systems that are involved in the oceans. For some of you, hopefully it's not a little too basic. Forewarning, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail just because we don't have a huge amount of time to do that. But if something here piques your interest, you can, of course, dive into more detail about them. And this hopefully will give you a sense of, if you don't already know, some of these concepts so that as we talk about the accounts, you can understand why certain indicators of condition might be necessary. And certainly when we talk about models, how these models might link into the account structures, and the different moving parts of the models. So we'll start off with a little of the Ocean Sciences 101 about the cycles and systems, then move on to what happens if we perturb these cycles, primarily focusing on carbon dioxide emissions and nitrogen inputs into the system. There's a lot of other ways we perturb systems, but those are just two that I think I wanted to highlight. And then wrapping up with very briefly looking at how we might be able to use assessment and accounts moving forward to understand the changes that are happening in the system. There's going to be an attempt to use some links. I will see how that works. If not, I'll just talk about it. So, the good place to start when we're thinking about the oceans are the ocean basins themselves. And this map here shows the four key ocean basins that are generally agreed as main ocean basins, which are the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian, and the Arctic Ocean basins. Now, you'll also see on this map some indications of the sub-basins, like the Argentine Basin, and a few key trenches and ridges that are highlighted there. And the reason these basins are important is that they're kind of since we're talking about accounts, they're organizing figures for a lot of the things that go on in the oceans, right? Organizing features for a lot of the things that go on in the oceans, where we have circulation currents that we'll talk about that are affected, and therefore certain attributes of these in terms of depth and topography that characterize the various basins. Now, if we wanted to look at the cross-section of the basin. So now we've gone underwater here, and we're looking at it from the side, right? And this is just a representative basin, not any one in particular. We can see that the ocean has a lot of different layers. And I think a little bit of this came up yesterday, and it's certainly going to come up when we talk more about marine units and some of the approaches that have been developed in that area, where we have differences in depth. And as you all might expect, the reason those differences in depth are important in the ocean is because sunlight does not penetrate all the way through to the ocean bottom. That top layer is what we call the sunlight zone, or more technically, I guess, the epipelagic zone. And that is where most of the familiar species that we think of on a day-to-day basis are. And you can see that's a very narrow, right, top 200 meters-ish of the ocean. Once you get below that, you have the mesopelagic zone, the bathypelagic zone, and then the abyssopelagic zone. And in some parts of the ocean, we go even deeper than that, the trench kind of systems that some of you are familiar with, right? And those can go to quite significant depths. And also on this graph, you can see that we're assuming the continent is over here, right, on the left side of the screen. And as we move off of the terrestrial area, we move down the continental shelf to the continental slope. And there's also this change in elevation that occurs as we move along that gradient. And what's important about that is that there are going to be, and we're going to get to it, different species that associate with the shelf areas versus the slope areas, and then even some that associate themselves with the abyssal areas, right, the very deep layers of the ocean. Now, these are not, this graphic here gives a sense that maybe we have this nice, smooth-looking basin. It turns out that actually when we start to go down and scan what the ocean basin looks like, hopefully you all can pick up what's going on here, there's differences in elevation, right? So much like we have our mountain and canyon systems on land, down at the bottom of the ocean, we also have our mountain and canyon systems. And this example here is showing an area in the Mariana Trench just east of Guam. And two features that I just wanted to highlight there are the North and South Chamorro seamounts, which you can hopefully see in the top center is the north one, and then the south one. And the reason I mention those seamounts now is because we're going to talk about them later. A lot of you are familiar with seamount structures. From a science and ocean point of view, those structures that are essentially jutting up out of the basin surface or the trench surface are running into currents that are coming across them, right? And those currents, which we will get to very shortly, are bringing with them plankton and larvae and other species that can settle on those seamounts and therefore start to build a food web in that area. And we'll get to how some studies that have been done looking at biodiversity around seamount structures. And this is obviously very zoomed in, right? This is a very small piece of the Mariana Trench down toward the southern part of it. Now, I kind of mentioned the circulation systems that we have in the ocean. Some folks have seen this before, this kind of map before. How many folks have seen this surface? Excellent, great. So we know that we have our surface circulation system of currents in the ocean. And when we talk about surface circulation, we're thinking about somewhere in the top 50 to 100 meters of the ocean. And those are driven by wind, right? These are wind-driven currents. So it's not too shocking to see when we look at these currents that they follow the direction of the prevailing winds, right? The trade winds and the westerlies, right? So you see that we have currents that move from east to west, and then in a lot of cases at some point, they bump into one of the continents. And as they bump into one of the continents, and because of Coriolis effect, which we could spend a lot of time talking about, right? These currents end up deflecting up north, bent toward the north. And then they form what are essentially gyres, right? So we can see our Pacific gyre in the North Pacific gyre, and then we can see our Atlantic gyre, right? That's forming, excellent. So we see our gyres here, right, where we have the currents going around the gyre systems. And one of the interesting things, just as a tidbit, some of you are probably familiar with this already, but on the western edge of these systems, because of a variety of physical region, the currents tend to be faster, right? So we have the faster currents going on the western edge. So the Gulf Stream current here and the Kuroshio current here, right, are the faster currents in the gyre systems. And then as they move up, they tend to get broader and more diffuse. And so those eastern boundary currents tend to be less boundaries because they tend to be dispersed. And so the energy disperses, right? And we know that these surface circulation systems are important because effectively what they're doing, right, is they're bringing warm waters from the equator up and along, up and to the north, right, toward the poles. And so for, Stony Brook is like right around here. So we're very obviously concerned about the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream for us tends to fuel quite a few hurricanes now and again, and occasionally they end up landing somewhere near New York City. Now, those current systems are not all that's going on, right? We don't just have surface circulation currents in the oceans. The other kinds of circulation, that's not where it's going. The other kinds of circulation system that we have are something called the thermohaline circulation, right? So these are our deep ocean current systems. And as thermohaline suggests, right, they're driven by temperature and salinity haline differences. And if this works, I have a little animation here showing some of that. Worked before. So, perfect. So we can see maybe slowly, very slowly moving, which will give me time to talk about it, that as those warm waters move northward, right, those warmer waters are cooling as they move northward. And as that water gets up into the Arctic, it cools a lot, and eventually some of that water will freeze. And when the water freezes, what it tends to do is push, so we have the ice that forms, right, and then the salt tends to get pushed out of those water ice crystals that form, right? And so what happens is the surrounding water becomes more saline. More saline water becomes denser than the surrounding cooler water, and that water will sink. And so that sinking water will then plunge down and go southward. And so then we have our deep circulation system that sets up. So we have our Arctic deep water circulation that flows from the Arctic down southward. And then we have our Antarctic intermediate water that flows northward from the Antarctic, right? And when we, let's see if we can. These currents matter because now we have our system where we have our deep water currents that hook up with our surface currents, right? And this sets up a general circulation pattern. And we said already that this matters because of the transfer of heat across the system. Now, the other thing that's moving in those systems, right, is oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nutrients. So the nutrients that are present up in those northern latitudes, right, that colder, more oxygen-rich, nutrient-rich waters are now going down to depth. And the reason I like this schematic is that it's showing you here that because of density differences between the bottom ocean layers and the upper ocean layers, there's this kind of boundary, right? We were talking about boundaries yesterday in a different sense. It's called the pycnocline that is based on density differences. And hopefully what you're seeing here is that this symbol here shows mixing that's happening between surface layers and lower layers. And the intensity of that mixing decreases as you move down with depth. So that means that if you're not in the surface here and you're down here, you're not getting access to a lot of the nutrients and oxygen that may be present in these upper surface waters, right? Essentially, you're shut off from that. So these deep currents that are set up are important because they are bringing to depth that oxygen and those nutrients, right, for organisms that are living down there. And we'll see in a second that those also come back up later on in certain areas, which helps fuel fisheries productivity and economies. And also these currents have movement of the organisms and their larvae, right? And just to quickly, I kind of skipped over carbon dioxide, but we know that the oceans have this important function of serving as sinks for carbon dioxide. So that carbon dioxide is pulled down into the oceans, and there's a lot of question about how long it will remain sequestered down there. And I should have mentioned in that circuit of thermohaline circulation, it's much slower than our surface currents, right? Our surface currents tend to be relatively quick compared to these. It'll take about 1,000 years for a particle move to complete that entire thermohaline circulation loop. So it's a long residence time down in the water, down in the various parts of the water column. I mentioned that those nutrients that are now in the deep waters, right? So we have our oxygen, nutrient-rich waters at depth that are cut off from the surface waters, generally in open ocean areas. Now, when we hit the coast, what's interesting is we have surface winds that, again, are blowing, right? We know that those set up currents. And those surface winds also tend to push water away from the shoreline. And remember, that's that top surface water of surface level of water, which is warmer and has been depleted of oxygen and nutrients because of biological activity that's going on in that area. So as that water is pushed offshore, what's going to replace it? The cold water from down below, right? And so that cold water brings up the nutrient-rich and oxygen water from below, and that then supports our phytoplankton communities and our zooplankton, which form, more on that to come, zooplankton, which feed on those, and eventually our fisheries, right? And so if we think of off the west coast of Peru, for example, well, I guess the only coast of Peru, the anchoveta fishery, right, is an example of where we have this upwelling zone happening, right? And those are important features. And what's interesting, as climate shift, the question is, are those upwelling zone areas going to change in their nature, right? Which might mean fish are not going to be in the same place as they used to be. And productivity is not going to be in the same place as they used to be. What are we talking about? I mentioned plankton before, and I wanted to show this example of an aquatic food web. It's really more of a trophic structure here, but we have phytoplankton, right? So those are our plants. So those are the organisms that are working to produce, using sunlight. They're our primary producers to generate carbon, right? And they will bloom in the presence of the right ingredients, much like your plants that you all might have, right? And when they bloom, those phytoplankton will be fed on by zooplankton, which are our tiny little animal species. And then those zooplankton provide a nice resource base for forage fish, right? So forage fish are eating the zooplankton, which are eating the phytoplankton. And then we get up to some of our more charismatic species, perhaps, that people think about a lot, which are our fishery species, right? That are our tunas, our redfish, our salmon, this is focused on the Pacific Northwest, the United States, and some of you may know salmon is a pretty big deal there. And then our marine mammals, which people tend to care about and be interested in, humpback whales, sea lions, and then our seabirds, right? So all of this is starting with our phytoplankton, right? Those nutrients coming up, interacting with sunlight in presence of gases and nutrients, and then fueling this food web. So if something happens to the bottom of this food web, something's going to happen to the top of the food web. And what's interesting about this is that, I think, these creatures that are up here, I'm sure many of you are familiar with them generally, even not specifically these species, right? Whales, our dolphins, our bird species. They're not sitting around and staying in one place. Some of these species have very long migration distances, right? So a food web effect that occurs in one place in one upwelling zone may have consequences that are felt far from where it's happening, right? And so mapping out those kind of interactions, I think, is one of these important things that we need to think through when we're developing conceptual models of the ocean, right? How things are moving across space, right? Because we're talking about a spatially derived, spatially grounded system. Now, if we look back at the image I showed before, which was the zones in the ocean, I just wanted to show here what kinds of sea life are associated with the different zones. Like I said, that epipelagic zone, the top zone, has, I know it's hard to see on this, but I did my best here, has species that we're familiar with, right? Our corals, our sea turtles, right? All of these things that many of our fisheries are associated with those. Move down to depth and creatures get a little more interesting and exciting, or at least less common, right? We end up seeing our sea cucumbers down with depth. And some people, I think one of the ones that's exciting, Finding Nemo, I think was mentioned. I think this character figures prominently in there, I believe. The anglerfish, I believe, showed up there. And so that's one of these exotic things at depth, right? And what's interesting, right, we don't have time to talk about all of this, but these creatures have obviously evolved to live at those depths. At these depths, they have no sunlight, right, that they're exposed to, and also they're dealing with extreme pressures that happen at depth, right, because you have a pile of water sitting on top of you. So their actual skeletal and body structures have evolved to deal with that, right? We don't do so well, right, when we go down to those kind of depths, for example. Now, I mentioned seamounts, just to move on to a little bit more about aquatic life. And one of the things that's interesting is people have noticed for a long time that there tend to be these fish that are associated with seamount structures, right? For the reasons I said, which are they serve as places for larvae to settle. So you have your mollusks, your shellfish settling in these locations. These then puts them, they're sticking up into the water and the currents are going by so they can feed on any plankton and nutrients that are coming by in those currents on the mount that's sticking out of the ocean bottom. And then those fish can serve those creatures can serve as the base of the food web, right? So we end up with this aggregating area of species, right? That fish are interested in being in this area, so to speak. So there was a study that was done in the preceding National Academy of Sciences that looked at seamount structures and biodiversity. I'm not going to go into detail about the way they measured biodiversity, but check out the paper if you're intrigued. But suffice to say that the redder indicates higher areas of biodiversity. And you can see that, if you can see this, the stars that are located here are where the seamounts are. And the way they did this was they looked at long-line fisheries. and the number of species that were caught in those areas. So those longline fisheries that were within proximity of a seamount. So it's not exactly perfect, but it's certainly a good proxy for that. And you can see that there tends to be these higher areas of biodiversity around where those seamounts are located. So these fish are associating themselves with the seamount. Again, these are important things for us to think of as we're developing a spatial kind of system, because as we all know, space is not the same uniformly. So what kind of condition indicator captures the fact that these systems this piece of ocean where the seamount is different than other pieces of ocean, right? What kind of indicators can we develop in those areas? Now, moving on to some chemistry here. This is the nitrogen cycle, which some of you may be familiar with. I'm not going to hopefully bore you all with too much chemistry, but takeaway message is that nitrogen gas that's up in the atmosphere goes into the ocean. Turns out most creatures are not able to deal with nitrogen gas in the form that it's in. So bacteria will what we call fix that nitrogen. That nitrogen then turns into a form, ammonium, that our phytoplankton and other microbes can take up. That ammonium can be nitrified again to nitrate, which again may be assimilated by those living creatures, those phytoplankton. So it's giving the fuel for those creatures, right? And as those die, they decompose, and they then are a source of organic nitrogen. Again, that organic nitrogen isn't so useful to most of these microbes, but bacteria, luckily, are around, and they will remineralize and break down that organic nitrogen back into ammonium, which then can be nitrified back into nitrate and re-enter the process. So we have this loop of nitrogen entering the system and then providing fuel for marine organisms. And the reason I'm bringing this up is we're going to talk about, in the next piece, how that loop can get perturbed by anthropogenic activity. So if you remember nothing from this slide, remember that having nitrogen in a bioavailable form like ammonium and nitrate provides fuel for these marine food webs, right? For the phytoplankton specifically. Another chemical system that I wanted to mention is the carbonate system, for reasons that I hope will become apparent in the next part. Carbon dioxide, right? I'm not going to talk a lot about the sink function of carbon dioxide in the oceans. I think it's very interesting. We talk a lot about that. I'm going to talk more about the buffering kind of system that goes on in the ocean that a lot of you may be aware of already, right? We have carbon dioxide up in the air, enters the sea, ends up in its aqueous form. In the water, there happens to be in the water a lot of H2O. That H2O, in reaction with the carbon dioxide, forms a weak acid which dissociates into bicarbonate, which is right here, and our hydrogen ion. And those who are chemists in the room know that hydrogen ions are associated, or maybe not, if you had some chemistry at some point, right? Hydrogen ions are associated with acidity. More hydrogen ions means higher acidity. Now, what's interesting is that, right, so we can see that more carbon dioxide will mean more hydrogen ions, which will mean higher acidity. Now, what's interesting for us that we'll get to is that bicarbonate ion is going to break down into carbonate ions. And again, this is simplified a bit, so apologies to chemists out there. And if those carbonate ions are out in the system and there's also calcium, because there's calcium in seawater, then our sea creatures that form shells and rely on shells to survive will take that calcium and that carbonate, turn it into calcium carbonate in the formation of their shell structures, right? And we'll talk about, again, what happens as we're forcing CO2 into this system. Now, I wanted to mention another system that is fairly important in a different way, right? We've been talking about chemical systems, physical circulation systems. This is a system in a different kind of sense, right? And these are estuarine systems. And a lot of you are familiar with what estuaries are, but I want to just call it out because they're really important because they're the place where our terrestrial system is interfacing with our coastal system. We have our river input that's coming in and interacting with the salt water. This is the Hudson River estuary. So if you imagine New York City is down around here, the Hudson River is tidal, right? So water is coming up. Our salty water from the Atlantic is coming up. The Hudson River is coming down from its watershed. And we have something that's called a salt wedge that's formed, right? So that salt wedge pushes up underneath the freshwater, so the freshwater is running over the top of it, and so you end up seeing that wedge can persist, and in New York, in the Hudson River, it goes up to about 80 to 100 miles depending on certain conditions, right? So you end up with what we call a more brackish environment that's a mix of fresh and salt water, and the reason that's relevant is certain species do really well in those environments, and they're species that we're very familiar with. And certain types of ecological habitat do well in those environments, right? Our salt marshes, our mangroves, right? They do well in these kind of estuarine environments where they've learned to thrive in a mixture of fresh, not quite as saline as open ocean, not quite as fresh as river water, right? So if we perturb that system, it will change things. For example, like I mentioned, that amount of salt water that gets up the Hudson River with the tides will change depending on the precipitation patterns that are happening, which will drive river flow, right? So if we have a climate system that shifts to have less precipitation and therefore less surface river flow, you will be able to push that saltwater wedge. The tides may be able to push that wedge further up the river, right? Which can change the structure of the ecological communities that are present as we move upstream. And also this area is important because that's where our pressures generally tend to emerge and enter the coastal system, right? And I'm thinking of human anthropogenic pressures here, right? A lot of our cities are located along estuaries for obvious reasons because of their productivity, and therefore the population pressures that we're familiar with can interact and interface with the ocean system there. So related to that, and our final system slide before we talk about perturbation, is that coastal-aware economic activity occurs in a lot of places, right? And we know that tends to be something we see globally. And there are a lot of attempts that are going on to try and look at how those coasts are contributing to GDP. We saw an example yesterday, right, of that. This is probably not going to work because it seems to be having issues. But this link here is to the economics data explorer that is set up for by work. Excellent. And the interesting thing about this is, we're not going to go into too much detail here, is that NOAA has set up this way of selecting a coastal area and then seeing what kinds of contributions there are to the ocean economy. And it compares that as a percentage of GDP, and you can then rank the different counties that are present in the country by their GDP. So I will be very biased here and pick New York, and then pick Suffolk County, which is where Stony Brook is. And you can see it generates total ocean economy, where it ranks in reference to all the counties within the country, the employment that's related to the ocean economy, the type of sectors that are involved, right? So this is the county that we're talking about. And you can see tourism and recreation are there, fisheries, and these other kinds of sectors, right? And this is just something to think about, since I know a lot of folks are in, right? Based on our discussions yesterday, this is just one way of easily displaying the data. It has its limitations. For example, when they're referring to the tourism and recreation economy, that brings in sectors that may not be completely tied to the coast, right? Like the restaurant sector. Certainly it has, people are driven to the coast and they will eat at restaurants, but is that tied to the presence of the coast? We need to figure that out a bit more, but it's certainly a good place to start with looking at these kind of data. So what happens when we shock the system in some way? And again, like I said, we're going to focus on carbon dioxide emissions and nutrients, so nitrogen, essentially. We're not going to talk a lot. We could have talked about the phosphorus cycle, also important in certain, particularly freshwater systems, but we'll focus on nitrogen because that tends to be an issue in the marine system. So one of the things that we know is happening with carbon dioxide emissions and associated temperature change is that sea level rise is occurring because of our melting glaciers and also from thermal expansion, right? Thermal expansion where the ocean is taking up more space, right, as it gets warmer. And so this is from NASA and just a map of sea level rise trends that have been happening. It's in millimeters per year, and something that won't surprise folks in the room, right? What's interesting about this is to see that the sea level trends are not the same across the entire ocean. Different places in the darker reds have seen higher sea level trends over this 23-year period than others, and there have been some places that have seen decreases in sea level, right? And one of the things to keep in mind that a lot of you probably do already when we're thinking about oceans, right, is that since there are these currents and these winds and everything that's going on, it's creating a topography of the water itself, right? The water is not completely flat and even. It also has its slopes and its hills, right, which drive movement of water. So that's why we end up with differences in sea level across space. And so this is an important perturbation to our system because it can lead to coastal flooding consequences, right? One of the things it can lead to, one of the important things. And this is a graphic that was generated by Climate Central, which some of you may be familiar with in conjunction with the New York Times. And essentially, they looked at the share of population exposed to coastal flooding. So as a percentage of total population, going from 2% to 8% and higher here. In the darker colors. And then the size of the box is the amount of people, right? So the percentage of people is the color, and then the size is the amount of people. And we can see that within this region, right, we have a lot of people exposed to, potentially exposed to coastal flooding. And this is assuming, right, this is assuming business as usual emission trends, and also that sea level rise responds to emission trends in the way that they expect, right? So this is not assuming we do anything to deal with carbon dioxide emissions, right? So it might be an overestimate if things happen to deal with carbon dioxide, right? But we can also see, again, as you've seen from the other slides, hopefully, is that the effects of this are not distributed evenly across space. And so there will be differences in economic impacts, which many of us are aware of, too. Melting sea ice is another interesting thing that happens when we perturb this system. And we can see the Arctic up here, and we can see the historic sea ice extent here, and then what it looks like most recently. And we can see we're losing a lot of that sea ice. There's a graphic here from the University of Colorado, and we can see what 2018 is shaping out to look like in the dark blue line there. That gray line is the median trend from 1981 to 2010. So you can see that sea ice extent is lower in 2018 than it has been over the median and is trending downward as we move, right, into the later parts of the year. And that's what we would expect, right? We would expect this cycle to be normally varying anyway, right? That you'd have more sea ice in the April months than you would by the end of summer, right? And this is from The Economist, right? Trying to be interdisciplinary here, right? And The Economist is showing here the minimum sea ice extent in 1980 and in 2016. And we can see, again, same story, there's less of it. So what does that mean for our marine systems, right? Should we pity the polar bear? And a lot of you may be familiar with the fact that we've seen a lot of polar bears that are not doing too well because they're not having access to their food resources, right? These polar bears need to depend on those shelf ice systems in order to forage for food. Now, one of the studies that was done is looking at how is habitat for polar bears changing, this is back in 2010, under current emission scenarios, right? So if we look at, again, we won't go into all of these scenarios. Suffice to say, they deal with different levels of emission control. The red line is a business as usual type scenario, and moving up to some mitigation of emission. And you can see that what happens is the optimal habitat as defined by ecologists for polar bears is going down as the amount of sea ice extent continues going down, and also of the shelf ice free months goes up, right? And that's because these polar bears are now not going to be able to access the same habitat they used to be able to have access to. Now, since we think about trade-offs, and certainly these accounts are going to be used to look at trade-offs, we might end up with a lot of happy humans as a result of this, despite our sad polar bears. And one of the reasons for this is that as that Arctic sea ice goes away, one study in 2013 looked and found that instead of the typical sea routes which rely on moving along the northern coast of Russia here, we now will have and these blue lines are non-icebreaker ships, right? That those non-icebreaker ships will be able to move closer and closer in, so therefore shorten their routes, right, across the Arctic. If you have an icebreaker in the red, they're projecting that by 2050-ish, there will be some that will be able to make those those traverse in September the Arctic, right? And so that can have economic consequences, right, for the countries that are within that region and for global trade, right? So there's going to be this interesting thinking through of trade-offs as we see these kind of things happening, right? Oh, and that's just that's an icebreaker that recently made the news in January and made its way through because it was able to. Usually you're not able to because the ice is too thick, but what's happening apart from there not being as much ice is the ice is thinner because it's melting and then a thinner layer is being generated, right? So it's easier to break through the ice when it's a thinner layer than when it's thicker. Another thing that's happening with climate change is that we have our shifting species. And this is just kind of walking through a few different studies of species that I've taken a look at before. Species are going to respond to temperature. They have an optimal temperature range that they like to be in. Surf clams, for example, over time, if we start here in the 80s and move down in 2002, what this graph is showing you is that this is depth increasing to the right. And those surf clams tend to be moving away from coast and out into deeper areas. That has implications, right, for the economy because those people who are relying on surf clams are now having to go further distances to get to them. So what are the economic implications of that and for the profitability of fisheries, right? So this is how we're trying to start to think about linking our ecosystem and economic models. This is red hake, which is a commercial species in the Northeast US. And hopefully you can see here, it's a little hard to see maybe, but this is the center of biomass distribution in the 60s. And what you can hopefully see is if you take a look at that one, where the center of biomass tends to be, and then take a look at 2003 to 2007, you can see that it shifted up to the north and east, right, in the US. That's the way it shifts for us because the warming waters are tending to move in that direction. American lobster is a similar story on Long Island, specifically, very local here. That's been a concern because our lobster fishery is now not really present anymore, right? And those lobster have moved, so we end up with a lot of unhappy Long Islanders, but a lot of happy Canadians to some extent until the market's flooded with lobsters, right? So you can see that distribution has shifted northward, right, to some extent here, right? And the area of overlap with past and present is the darker purple, which is right around here, but there's a lot of northward movement up there. And finally here, we're looking at cod, which is A and C. Those were the only ones that they saw significant northward movement for off the coast of England, the UK. And we saw, so that means that for cod, for example, it's moving from this latitude up to a little further north. And then for the snake blenny, it's moving from down here up to further north, right? So these shifting species are important, not just because of the economic consequences of it, but also because it's a loss of gain of biomass that's part of that food web. So when that food web changes, you may end up with cascading effects, with things that used to feed on certain species that are present are now not able to have those species available. And so those cascading effects are something we'll have to think about with perturbations to the system. And again, the big challenge for us is going to be, how do we put all this or think about all this in an accounting context versus what do we leave for scientists, economists, ecologists to use in their analysis of data that is generated by the accounting system, right? And what's really interesting to look at, and we're not going to be able to talk about it too much, is new predators that enter systems, right? So those predators like orcas that have moved from southern areas to northern areas are now challenging species that never had to fight for their food before or were never preyed on by species before, right? Which therefore has implications for their food webs. And so ocean acidification is why I mentioned this carbonate cycle. Again, like I mentioned, we end up with more hydrogen ions in the system. If there's more hydrogen ions, what happens is they compete with calcium for the carbonate, which is the CO3 there. And so therefore, there's less of that available to creatures to form their shells. And this just shows the change in aragonite saturation, which is a way of measuring the likelihood of dissolution of aragonite or precipitation of aragonite. Dissolution meaning is aragonite or calcium carbonate not going to be present, or is it going to be present? And the trend is what's important here, which is the red areas show that that's decreasing. And so higher red means it tends to favor dissolution of the calcium carbonate. And so what's ongoing area of research is what is the exact mechanism that acidification may affect those marine creatures that form shells? because even if they're still able to form shells, it might mean they need to use more energy to do it, right? They might be exposed to stress that takes away from their ability to perform other life-sustaining functions, right? And so it's an area of active and ongoing research. And lastly here, I wanted to talk about nitrogen cycle perturbation. And primarily from sewage and fertilizer, right? We end up with a lot of nitrogen entering the ocean environment. As populations increase, there tends to be an increase in both of those things, sewage and fertilizer. And if those wastes are untreated, we end up with new nitrogen entering the system. That new nitrogen is generally in a bioavailable kind of form, right? Or can be made bioavailable. It will push upward, provide more fuel, right, for those phytoplankton, which provide more fuel for the zooplankton and for the fish. So great, everything's perfect. So now we have more food for the fish, we get more fish. Well, the only problem with that is, as those fish die, they fall to the bottom. As those phytoplankton die, they fall to the bottom. And there are bacteria that are very happy to decompose those things that are falling to the bottom. Bacteria like to consume oxygen, or have to consume oxygen. I don't know if they like to. Never talked to a bacteria. But as they consume that oxygen, it will decrease the oxygen levels at depth, right? And that's why we end up with our dead zone areas, which are these areas of low dissolved oxygen. So while bacteria are happy in those areas, other things are not, right? And fish species that need oxygen, right? And our mollusks and other species that are attached to the benthos or the ocean bottom are also dependent on oxygen in those areas, right? And so these are just a few dead zones from around the world. We have the Gulf of Mexico dead zone, and we can see that red is the area of severe hypoxia over time, and it's a pretty substantial area. And again, in 2017, I believe what this is saying, it's about the size of New Jersey, which New Jersey is not a big state, but still, that's a pretty big area. Bay of Bengal, right? That's the approximate size of the dead zone there. And then the maximum extent of the dead zone in the Baltic Sea, right? So these are some areas where we're concerned with these low oxygen levels, right? So how do we incorporate that kind of a condition measure when we're thinking about accounting, right? Our dissolved oxygen. It could be pretty straightforward. But we need to think through the linkages to the ecosystems, right? Not all species are going to be affected in the same way by those low oxygen levels, right? Fish may not be as affected since they are able to swim away from those areas, right? And those organisms that cannot swim away or less mobile are more likely to be affected. And if those organisms are affected, like our shellfish, how does that affect the populations that depend on those creatures, right? So we can start to build our environment economy linkages. So to wrap up here in the last piece, just wanted to talk about some of the assessments that's ongoing, right? So we have these systems that are changing, and what we'd like to know is how are these systems changing and what way are these systems changing? Well, NOAA has set up an integrated ecosystem assessment approach for several areas around the United States. I know that some folks have mentioned others that are going on globally. The Pacific Islands, California Current, Gulf of Mexico, off the Northeast Shelf, Great Lakes, and Alaska, right? And what's interesting about what they're doing in these areas is they're developing these indicator systems, or have developed these indicator systems that track condition over time. And they're not just biological condition. They're also trying to incorporate, as feasible, economic indicators into these approaches. These are long-term, and the goal of this is to build a long-term data set, right? So we have the right indicators. You can then design the monitoring program that's appropriate to track the changes that you're concerned about. So we will see how the data collected tell us more about these systems over time and how they're changing, right? How the water quality conditions are changing and physical characteristics of the water like temperature and aragonite levels are changing and oxygen levels, and then how the species that are associated with those spatial areas are also changing. The World Ocean Assessment, many of you may be familiar with this, was completed in 2015. And you can check out the documents are all available online. It was organized around 10 key themes, which I won't go into here, but there are lots of things that I think came up here and there in discussions and a bit in this talk today, right? Which are things that they're concerned in looking at. Patterns of biodiversity, for example, which is spatially generated impact of climate change, right? And one of the things that World Ocean Assessment pointed out in their work is that an organizing system for the data that can inform these types of assessments in the future would be beneficial, right? So the question for all of us to think about is, how do ocean accounts help to inform global assessments down the line? One of the questions. We have a lot of questions, it seems, but that's one of them. Michael talked yesterday a lot about accounts and the possible role of accounts. Just to mention a few things and reiterate a few things here. I think the interesting thing about accounting systems and in the work that we've done around Stony Brook and in Long Island is that even if it's not perfect, it can start to provide some structure for linking the economic and environmental, and it can force you to build those conceptual models that link the ecosystem to the economy and the condition indicators that you care about and how they're changing to the economy. It can help us do global comparisons efficiently, right? So we know that we're all using similar indicator systems and having similar outputs, working with the same base structure. And apart from these kinds of things, it also just gives an opportunity for us to start organizing the vast amount, because there is a lot of data out there. So the vast amount of data that are out there and the vast amount of models that have been generated looking at ocean systems, right? How can we start to organize those models and say, what questions are these models good for answering, and what indicators can they help us to inform, right? And then once we start to have the models and we ask them questions and they're not able to answer questions, which they won't be able to do because they're models, right? They don't learn, although I guess more sophisticated ones can. We then can identify what the data and model gaps are, right? And that can prompt future research and future development of models. That's where I'll wrap up. I think I was about on time. If anyone has any questions or would like to talk more, just some of my contact info. Thanks very much, and look forward to questions.